For the last couple of months, we've been thinking about spiritual success. And I hope that none of us have confused this with material or worldly success. The reality is that people do get confused, and they do manage to see things back to front. And the 8th chapter of Mark's Gospel is a good example of that. You might think that being one of the 12 disciples and sitting down with Jesus, listening to Jesus every day, it was impossible to be confused about the truth. Mark clearly shows us how wrong we would be to assume this, and how far away Jesus' first disciples were from a correct understanding of Jesus. This portion of Scripture is like a mountain from which, if our eyes are open, if the weather is clear, we can survey the whole of Mark's Gospel from this vantage point. The first story of this chapter tells how around 4,000 men were out in the countryside, where for 3 days they had been listening to Jesus teaching. There were presumably also women and maybe children there as well, but Mark says simply that it's a large crowd. And they've run out of food. Jesus blessed 7 loaves and a few small fish, and it was enough to feed everyone, including the 4,000 men. He then went by boat with the disciples across the lake to Dalmanutha, where the local people demanded a miracle to prove who he was. And Mark says that Jesus sighed. And I imagine Jesus still sighs today at anyone who demands a miracle as proof. That's not why he performed miracles. And so Jesus refused. He instead got straight back into the boat with the disciples, and they all left. As they sailed back, the disciples realized they'd brought only 1 loaf of bread. They started to argue with each other, blame each other. And when they did this earned them a scolding from Jesus, who no doubt could feed 12 people with 1 loaf just as easily as he could feed over 4,000 with 7 loaves. He told them they didn't understand. He said they had entirely missed the point. On their arrival at Bethsaida, Jesus healed a blind man. But they're soon on their way again. Jesus and his disciples left Galilee and went up to the villages near Caesarea Philippi. This was a long walk from the low place up the slopes of Mount Hermon and into a region of non-believers, people who worshipped pagan gods, in particular the god Pan. Why did Jesus take the disciples all that way, a good distance from the normal to and fro around the lake, to have a conversation that takes place from verse 27? Mark is telling a story here. He's telling a story with word pictures. And word pictures are how the Bible is, from start to finish. It's full of word pictures. The Hebrew way was not to focus on the words themselves, which is what we sometimes do, but to remember and focus on the pictures. It is how people without books remember their history. and their wisdom. There's a picture in verse 23 of Jesus leading a blind man out of his village and partially restoring his sight so that people look like trees that are walking around. Now, in the same way, to help his disciples gain sight, he takes them away from the lake and from the crowds. So here's the image of the disciples seeing Jesus not as he is, but instead seeing him as a prophet. Just as the blind man couldn't clearly see people. Mark says that once Jesus had got them far away from the crowds, he asked his closest disciples, "Who do you say I am?" At last, they had their eyes opened, and they could see that Jesus was not a miracle worker or a prophet like Moses or Elijah. And so Peter replied, "You are the Messiah. You are the Messiah." What's also true here is that the disciples didn't fully understand what it is that they can see now. When they call Jesus the Messiah, they don't mean what you might mean when you call Jesus the Messiah. For them, the Messiah was still the true King of Israel, the final heir to the throne of David, the one before whom Herod Antipas and all the other would-be Jewish princelings are just shabby little impostors. The disciples were not expecting a divine redeemer. They were longing for a king. And they thought that they had found one. This is obviously a direct challenge to the newest pagan god in Caesarea Philippi, who had just had a huge temple built for his worship. He is the Roman emperor himself. I think now would be good for all of us to take a moment to examine our own answers to this question. Who do we say Jesus is? Who do you say Jesus is?